Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I worked for a very small business back in 2018, owned by a wealthy couple who had moved here from a Western European country. When I started, there were only 3 employees total, including me. The job seemed easy enough at first, but I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. They told me the position would start with a 2-week training period where I would work alongside another person. After those 2 weeks, I would handle weekday shifts alone and work weekends with one other employee. This setup meant we could never take proper lunch breaks, which violated our state's labor laws. Nobody ever asked me to sign any waiver about this, and they never mentioned during hiring that breaks would not be allowed. The business offered gluten-free options and made a big deal about it on social media. Any other establishment in our state would have followed strict sanitation requirements to prevent cross-contamination. But these owners were shockingly careless about the whole thing. They never even asked me for a copy of my food handler's license before putting me to work in the kitchen. They handed me some rags and explained that I should clean the entire shop with those and plain water. There were no separate cooking surfaces or utensils set aside specifically for the gluten-free menu items. A few weeks after I was hired, they brought in large jugs of sanitizer. They explained that a health department inspector was expected to visit soon. They told me not to actually use the sanitizer because using it regularly would cost too much money. However, I needed to keep it somewhere visible and lie to the health inspector about our sanitation practices if asked. Things only got worse from there. Each paycheck included a flat amount labeled as tips, ranging from $40 to $80. The amounts were always rounded to the nearest $5, which seemed suspiciously low. When I worked the register, I could see hundreds of dollars coming in as card tips, and I knew those tips were only being split between myself and 2 other people. Based on what I saw, we should have been making that bi-weekly figure per person in just one busy day. The owner would get abnormally upset whenever my coworker and I tried to split our tips at the end of each shift. He knew about things like that because he installed surveillance cameras shortly after hiring me. He watched the footage constantly throughout the day, often monitoring the shop from his car parked in a nearby lot. Before long, I started getting reprimanded regularly for going against those early warning signs I had noticed. If he caught me eating lunch on camera, he would tell me he did not care whether I ate or not. But I had better look ready to cook if a customer happened to walk past the window. I had to stay positioned at the register but could not let anyone see me eating. I often went entire days without eating more than one meal because my shifts were so long, and I never got more than a minute to put food in my mouth. If he saw me using the sanitizer, he would insist I was wasting his money. I told him I felt concerned about using the same cooking utensils for gluten-free dishes that I used for regular dishes containing gluten. I explained that since so many customers had gluten sensitivities or allergies, it seemed like only a matter of time before someone got sick. He dismissed my concerns entirely and said he had been operating this way for over a year without anyone getting sick, so there was no point in worrying about it. I noticed my tips were about $10, less than usual that pay period. The owner also expected us to cook for customers if we were still physically present in the shop, no matter how far along we were in our closing procedures. We were never allowed to turn anyone away, but we would not be paid overtime if closing took longer as a result. We also were not permitted to start any closing procedures early because he did not want customers to think we were closed, even if we actually were. Eventually, one of the other employees announced she was pregnant. When her pregnancy progressed, she became less able to carry out many of her responsibilities. It became medically necessary for her to stop doing heavy lifting, to be able to sit down when needed, and to have access to proper breaks and lunches for adequate nutrition. The owner reprimanded her for these accommodations and told her he expected her to work at the same capacity she had before her pregnancy. He added that she should not let pregnancy make her lazy. and that if she did not remain active and she let herself eat all the time, her baby would come out fat, just like her. She tried to call out sick one day. She had to rush to the hospital because she was experiencing abnormalities in her pregnancy and feared she might be having a miscarriage. She and the baby turned out to be fine, but the owner yelled at her for missing her shift. He told her he did not care if she miscarried because her responsibility was to him first. She ended up quitting, but somehow remained friends with him afterward, which I honestly could not understand. The owner's wife started writing passive-aggressive notes, explaining that they were always watching us during our shifts. The notes said they would start deducting from our tips if we made any mistakes. If we made a cooking mistake that resulted in wasted ingredients, it would come from our tips. If we broke an item in the inventory, it would come out of our tips. If we took too long to finish closing duties, there would still be no overtime pay, and it would come out of our tips. It became increasingly obvious that the owners were including themselves in the tip pool, which is also illegal in our state. I was the only employee at the time who did not feel threatened by these people. My other co-worker was an undocumented immigrant from the same country as the owners. They treated her terribly and she felt like she could not do or say anything about it. They repeatedly and falsely told her that she had no rights in this country. They manipulated her into thinking they were so nice to hire her when no one else would. She felt like she had to work for them and do whatever they told her to do, because if she did not, she would lose her only source of income with no guarantee of finding another one. Whenever anyone confronted the owners about any of their violations, they would act shocked and insist they were so new to the country that they did not know any of the laws yet. They claimed any of their behavior was just a cultural difference. They relied on these two defenses so much that they never bothered to actually protect themselves from a legal standpoint. I already knew I wanted to quit, and that I wanted to alert local authorities to all their violations. The final straw came when they cut my pay for making mistakes while I was exhausted and processing personal trauma. They made me sign a contract agreeing to the pay cut, but then applied it retroactively to the pay period before the contract was even signed. While it was frustrating not getting that extra money, I laughed for 20 minutes straight when I put together my pay stub and my copy of the contract. They had offered themselves up on a silver platter because of their own incompetence. I documented everything I possibly could. Because everything was so ridiculously illegal, I had compiled a thick portfolio of evidence in no time. I filed a wage complaint at the same time I handed in my 2 weeks' notice. Once they found out about the wage complaint, they started a slander campaign against me, which resulted in me losing my next job. I did not have hard evidence of the slander, so I let it go and applied somewhere else. The stolen tips really messed up my taxes. My former bosses reported my actual tips to the Internal Revenue Service, but kept me in the dark about the figure. They gave me so much less that I ended up owing the Internal Revenue Service $400 more than what I had expected. I spent the time between my employment with them and the hearing with a labor commissioner at the Department of Labor working alone on my case. On the day of the hearing, my former bosses brought their immigration lawyer, along with a stranger they had paid off, to pretend to be my co-worker. The lawyer had no idea why I had filed a complaint against him in the first place. All the evidence he presented against me had nothing to do with my claims of not getting paid overtime, not getting my meal breaks, and having my tips stolen. It was all just fake letters from fake people with ridiculous, obviously made-up names. All the documents he presented looked like they could have been typed up the night before. The whole thing was pathetically bad. Their defense relied heavily on slander. The lawyer asked the labor commissioner who would be more trustworthy, him, a straight-A university student at a prestigious school, or me, an uneducated lowlife with an entry-level job. Every time I presented hard evidence to the labor commissioner, the lawyer scrambled to come up with an explanation for why I was lying, but failed miserably each time. When I showed the labor commissioner my contract about the pay cut, alongside the pay stub reflecting a retroactive cut, the lawyer still did not understand what was happening. Their defense crumbled and the labor commissioner poked several holes in their stories. Fast forward to about a year later. I received a check in the mail for $2,300, which meant I was awarded every single penny that was due to me. What made this even sweeter was the date on the check. It was the exact same date the stay-at-home order due to the pandemic started in our city. Not only were they losing money due to decreased business because of the virus, but they were legally required to pay me out at the same time. I would not be surprised if they did not survive the economic impact. Unlike the vast majority of small businesses in my area, though, they actually deserved to fail. I moved into this dorm-style building about 6 months ago, drawn by the affordable rent and central location. The place was always buzzing with energy from students and young professionals like me, which made it feel alive despite its age. I had just started a new job across town and needed somewhere cheap, while I saved up for something better. The building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that reminded me of my college days. What I didn't realize on move-in day was just how thin the walls were between apartments. I remember the first night I discovered this unfortunate reality. It was around midnight and I was nestled in bed with a book, finally unwinding after a long day of unpacking. Suddenly, the blare of a TV erupted from somewhere nearby, startling me so badly that my book thumped to the floor. The noise seemed to be coming from the apartment next door. I pressed my ear against the wall and the sounds of a late-night talk show host laughing boomed through as if he was broadcasting directly into my bedroom. The next day, I decided to address the issue politely. I wrote a friendly note on some notebook paper hoping my neighbor was well, and explaining that her TV had been quite loud the previous night, making it hard for me to sleep. I asked if she could please lower the volume in the late hours and thanked her in advance. I slipped it under her door on my way to work, hopeful for a quieter evening. However, when the sun set and the city quieted down, the volume from next door did not. The walls vibrated with the bass of an action movie, shattering any hopes of a peaceful night. Frustrated, I knocked on her door the following day. When she opened it, I was met with a glare from a woman in her 50s with a permanent scowl etched into her face. She snapped at me, asking what I wanted before I could even speak. I introduced myself and explained that I was wondering if she might be able to keep the TV down at night because it was quite loud in my apartment. She looked at me coldly and told me that she paid rent here, same as me, and that she would do as she pleased in her apartment. I tried to reason with her, pointing out that the walls were very thin and it was quite disruptive. She suggested that maybe I needed better earplugs, then slammed the door in my face before I could respond. That night, the volume went up even higher. It felt deliberate, like a noisy declaration of war. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while car chases and gunshots echoed through my bedroom. It was impossible to think, let alone sleep. I found myself missing lines in my book, losing track of paragraphs, while the noise invaded every thought. Over the next few weeks, I knocked gently on the shared wall whenever the TV blared too loudly. Sometimes I'd hear her scoff or yell through the thin barrier, telling me to mind my own business. Once, she even banged back with what sounded like a hammer. It was wearing me down. The lack of sleep and constant tension made me feel trapped in my own home. Days turned into weeks, and the constant battle with the TV volume became a miserable routine. Despite my initial hope that she might soften over time, Karen only seemed to become more obstinate. It was like the louder her TV blared, the more she proved her point. This was her territory. One chilly evening, after another exhausting day at work and dreading the return to my noisy apartment, I decided to try talking to Karen again. Perhaps face to face we might reach some understanding. I waited by the stairwell, timing it so I could casually run into her. When she climbed the stairs with grocery bags hanging from each arm, I stepped forward and greeted her. She barely acknowledged me, asking flatly what I wanted. I suggested that maybe we could work out a schedule or something for the TV, just so it would be a bit quieter at night. She stopped, turning to face me with a deepening frown. She told me she didn't know what my problem was and that she was just living her life. She added that if I couldn't handle a bit of noise, maybe this wasn't the place for me. I protested that it wasn't just a bit of noise, explaining that it was very loud and affecting my sleep. Karen rolled her eyes. shifting the bags in her hands. She said she wasn't changing anything and that I should just deal with it. With that, she turned and continued up the stairs, leaving me standing there more frustrated than before. That night, when the TV began its usual evening ritual, louder than ever, something inside me snapped. I walked over to the shared wall and knocked hard. 3 sharp raps. The TV volume dipped momentarily before roaring back to life even louder. From the other side, I heard her voice, shrill and angry, telling me to stop banging on the wall and calling me a lunatic. I knocked again, desperation edging into my actions. This was my home too, and I deserved peace. She shouted through the wall, asking if I wanted to play that game. Suddenly, the sound of something heavy hitting the wall from her side made me jump back. The following day, feeling hollow from lack of sleep, I made a decision. If talking wouldn't work, maybe it was time to involve someone else, someone who had the authority to intervene. I looked up the non-emergency number for the local police station and dialed. The officer who answered asked how he could help. I explained that I wanted to file a noise complaint against my neighbor. He asked if I had tried talking to my neighbor about the issue. I told him I had tried multiple times, that it was very disruptive, and that she wasn't cooperative, adding that I wasn't sure what else to do. The officer sighed on the other end of the line, and he said he would log the complaint but added that, honestly, these things were better resolved between neighbors. When night approached that day, and the familiar sound of a TV turning on seeped through the walls, I braced myself. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was a typical Friday night, and I had invited a couple of friends over for a gaming session, hoping to distract myself from the ongoing feud with Karen. When we set up the gaming console and piled snacks on the coffee table, the atmosphere was light and jovial. My friend Mike said cheerfully that it was finally some fun around here, tossing a controller my way. I agreed, mentioning that it had been tough with all the noise next door. Just when we settled into the game, the familiar roar of Karen's TV pierced through the walls, louder than ever, like it was time to ruin our evening. The sound effects from the action movie she was watching clashed with the game's audio, making it hard to concentrate. Emma asked if that sound was coming from next door. I confirmed that it was Karen and that she loved her TV loud. Mike expressed his shock, asking how I even managed to sleep with that noise. I admitted that I didn't sleep very well. Frustrated, I stood up and knocked on the wall, hoping she'd get the hint. Instead, the volume increased. I knocked again, harder this time. The response was immediate, a loud banging from her side. Emma exclaimed in shock, asking if she was for real. Suddenly, a door slammed on Karen's side and we heard the heavy footsteps thundering toward my door. The aggressive knocking that followed made us all jump. Mike asked nervously who that was. Peeking through the peephole, my stomach dropped. A large, burly man stood angrily outside, yelling for me to open up and saying he needed to have a little talk with me, calling me a punk. Confused, I shouted back, asking who he was and why he was banging on my door like this. He glared through the peephole and announced that he was her son, calling me a jerk and saying that I kept knocking on the wall and disturbing his mom. He added that I was going to learn a lesson today. Realizing the situation was spiraling, I turned to my friends and told them I wasn't opening that door. Mike nodded in agreement, saying that was a good call. He then asked if the guy looked like he was leaving. I said no, reporting that he was just standing there looking furious. Emma suggested we should call the cops. When I reached for my phone, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. He yelled another warning, demanding that I open up. I dialed 911 quickly, explaining the situation in hurried, breathless sentences to the dispatcher. I told them there was someone trying to break into my apartment and that he was threatening us. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. Finally, we heard the sound of police sirens outside and the knocking ceased. Peering out, I saw the man retreating back to Karen's apartment. When the police arrived, they took our statements and I explained the ongoing issues with Karen. I told them that her son had just tried to break down my door. One of the officers said they would handle it from here. Mike tried to lighten the mood when the officers left, joking that this was one way to end a game night. Emma added that it was the most dramatic game night ever. When my friends packed up to leave, the reality of what could have happened if that door had given way settled over me. This was no longer just about noise, it was about safety. The evening following the confrontation with Karen's son was eerily quiet. Perhaps it was the presence of the police that prompted some semblance of peace, or maybe Karen and her son were plotting their next move. Either way, the silence was both a relief and a source of anxiety. I knew it couldn't last. The next few days passed without incident, and I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. That hope was shattered one evening when I was making dinner. The sound wasn't the usual blast of the TV, but something far more menacing. A series of heavy, muffled thuds against the sheared wall. I froze, a chill running down my spine. I muttered to myself, wondering what was happening now. I set down the kitchen knife and moved cautiously toward the living room. The thuds grew louder, more aggressive, and then the unthinkable happened. A hatchet blade burst through the wall, splintering the plaster and leaving a gaping hole. I recoiled in horror. I yelled out that this couldn't be happening. I backed away when the blade pulled back and then smashed through another part of the wall. Panicked, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I shouted into the phone that he was back and that he was breaking through the wall with a hatchet. The dispatcher remained calm and told me that officers were on their way, instructing me to stay on the line. When I waited, praying for the police to arrive quickly, Karen's son managed to create a hole large enough to climb through. He emerged, hatchet in hand, his face twisted with rage. Just then, Mike, who had been hanging around at my place again, along with some of my other friends, jumped into action. He grabbed a heavy glass vase from the coffee table and threw it. It hit Karen's son squarely on the head, momentarily stunning him. Mike yelled for him to get back and pulled me behind him for protection. Karen's son shook off the impact and advanced. Another friend rushed out from the kitchen wielding a kitchen knife. He screamed at Karen's son that he needed to leave immediately. Ignoring the warning, Karen's son stormed at us, just when the police sirens wailed outside. My friend reacted swiftly, stabbing him in the leg. He screamed in pain and fell to his knees, dropping the hatchet. The next few minutes were a blur of blue uniforms and shouting. The police burst through the door, quickly assessing the situation. They handcuffed Karen's son, who was now shouting incoherently. Karen appeared at the threshold of the hole in the wall, screaming that we had hurt her boy. She tried to push past an officer to reach her son. Mike explained to the police what had happened, telling them it was self-defense and that Karen's son had come at us with a hatchet. The officers nodded, taking statements from all of us while they waited for an ambulance to arrive for Karen's sonman. The aftermath was a mess of paperwork, questions, and a lingering fear that hung over me like a dark cloud. Eventually, we were all taken to the station to give more formal statements. However, the police were clear that our actions were justified given the situation. Karen was evicted by the landlord after the incident, furious about the damage and the danger posed to other tenants. Her son was taken into custody, and I later learned he had prior convictions for assault, which added serious weight to the charges against him. When I finally returned home, the broken wall seemed to symbolize a hard-won peace. The landlord arranged for repairs to begin the next week, and I made sure to document everything for insurance purposes. I knew things would never be quite the same, but at least the nightmare was over. The building felt different now, quieter in ways that had nothing to do with noise levels. I eventually moved out a few months later, finding a place with better soundproofing and more reasonable neighbors. But I'll never forget those weeks of hell, or how a simple request for quiet nearly cost me everything. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.